So I am delighted to introduce our faculty for this webinar series, Dr. Denver Brunsman, who's zooming in today from the DC metro area. Dr. Brunsman started working with Humanities Texas in the summer of 2016, so he may be a familiar face to a number of you. Since then, he's become an invaluable faculty member, a trusted advisor on our teacher programs, and sharing with us his expertise on early American history. He has an extraordinary ability to connect with secondary classroom teachers, and because of that, we've invited him to be part of more than 30, probably way more than that at this point, programs. So to give you a little bit background information about Denver, he received his BA from St. Olaf College and his MA and PhD from Princeton. He currently chairs the history department at George Washington University, where he writes about and teaches the social and political history of the American Revolution, the early American Republic, and the British Atlantic world. He's the author of a 2013 award-winning book titled The Evil Necessity, British Naval Impressment in the 18th Century Atlantic World, and is also the co-author of the leading college and AP US history textbook, Liberty, Equality, Power, A History of the American People. At GW, he runs a course entitled George Washington and His World, where he teaches annually on site at Washington's Mount Vernon estate, which is pretty cool. He's also an award-winning teacher. In 2018, he received the Oscar and Shoshana Trachtenberg Prize for Teaching Excellence at GW. He has also served as the higher ed chair of the College Board, AP US History Development Committee, and just as he's a student favorite at GW, he's also always a hit at our teacher programs. And I know these webinars, or should I say history happy hours, will be no exception. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Denver Brunsman.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Liz. It's so great to be here. I signed in from Washington, Texas, and that's because part of me is in Texas always because of Humanities Texas. And this is indeed the History Happy Hour. It was a little bit, I had to bring it out of retirement, but I got the huzzah glass, got Washington on the other side. So we're going to get going here. I've been reading my Texas Teaks, refreshing all week. And I think tonight we're going to hit the battles of Saratoga, Yorktown. We're going to do the Winter Valley Forge, the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And the big one, of course, is the role and leadership provided by George Washington in the American Revolution and the founding of the country. So as Liz said, this is part 1 of 2, and we'll do the next one next week, the same time on the presidency. I'm going to try to share those slides here, and we will get started. All right. So the title of this lecture is Republican General, and I think if it has a broad argument, it's that Washington advances the principles of the American Revolution through the war. They're not two different things. Washington doesn't just, fight the war as some kind of separate process, but it's very much a part of the revolution. And that's how contemporaries at the time thought of it. Today, we think of the revolution, I think, much more about, protests and tar and feathering and all of that. But in the immediate aftermath of the events, they really thought about it as the war. So if we keep going here, I'll show you the plan. There's a lot of winning tonight. So much winning, we might be tired of winning by the end. We'll see. We'll see. We're gonna fight the beginning of the war, the end of the war, and then we'll look at the peace process. So to get started, I just want to put up this list of American wars and longest wars in American history. And I'm dating myself because when I started teaching college, I was the Revolutionary War came in number 2, and it's fallen to number 4. But it's still in this, top group, along with our more contemporary wars in the 20th and 21st century. And I think it points to Washington's leadership challenge, and that was keeping together, this country, really, this brand new country, fighting in war for a very long time. And when we look at this list, this is what the Pentagon would call asymmetrical conflicts, where there's a stronger opponent on paper and a weaker opponent. But in reality, that weaker opponent had certain advantages, particularly to basically just stay alive, to keep a revolution or an insurrection going long enough so that it could be successful, so that the stronger power essentially stopped fighting. But the key to that was for the weaker power to also stay united. And again, this I think was Washington's chief leadership accomplishment during this period. So this is the big spoiler alert. This is how America wins, I think. The combination of the American Continental Army and the militia working together, and I'll talk various times about both of those. The challenge that Britain faced fighting this war 3,000 miles away, which was very difficult. The contributions of France and Spain. We'll get a little bit into colonial Texas in this talk and talk about the contribution of Bernardo Galvez to America's victory. And then finally, the man of the hour, George Washington, his leadership truly was critical to America's victory. So we're going to talk more about this with our documents about how Washington becomes chosen to lead the American forces. But it happened at the Second Continental Congress. And the Second Continental Congress began meeting in May of 1775. And we have to keep in mind that it was a war Congress from the start because Lexington and Concord, also on the Texas Teaks, had of course started in April the previous month. And so Washington came dressed for success. He had his experience in the French and Indian War as a leader of the Virginia regiment, essentially the Virginia militia. And this is the uniform that he wore in that role. And he wore his Virginia militia uniform to the Continental Congress. And this is really his way of advertising in the 18th century kind of way that he wanted to be the leader of American forces. It was seen as, really something that was not dignified to actually campaign or lobby to have a position. You wouldn't actually say you wanted to do it. So this was his, kind of not so subtle way of saying, I want to do this. We now know that the uniform that he wore, his Fairfax militia uniform, was actually in the buff or sort of yellowish and blue colors that he'd wear in the Continental Army. And we know that these were actually his favorite colors. So the uniform here is not quite right, but we'll get to the buff and blue shortly. So after he's picked to lead the American forces in the late spring of 1775, he immediately goes to Boston, where the Massachusetts militia had driven back the British army to Boston after the battles of Lexington and Concord. And they essentially surround the city. And the big question becomes how to dislodge the British from Boston. And this went on for months. It went on into the winter of 1776. Washington even had the idea to actually just attack the British, which at that point would have required ice skates over the Boston Harbor. So one of his, favorable traits as a leader is he was willing to change his mind in the face of new evidence. And his men said, "Oh, there might be a better way. We might be able to, get cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. It's only hundreds of miles away, but we'll use sleds pulled by horses and bring, those cannon, from New York all the way to Boston. Take the high ground around Boston, and we'll basically force the British out." So it sounds like kind of a crazy idea, almost as crazy as skating, across the harbor, but it worked, and this was, America's first really big victory. But after this, it became very difficult. The British arrived in New York City, which was the next theater of operations, with the largest armada, combined soldiers and sailors that they would have until World War II. So more than 30,000 men. Washington divided his army. He already had a disadvantage, but he divided his army and was routed at New York. And I love this contemporary painting that kind of shows the disparity between the American and British forces. And this was really the low point of Washington's career. The most success he had was actually escaping to the point that scholars today debate whether the British actually let him go because they thought they had won the entire war and they needed to keep Washington alive to surrender. But he escapes across New Jersey and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And he decides to change his tactics. And that's reflected in this letter that he writes to Congress. John Hancock at the time was the president of Congress. And what he says is, if you look on the third line, he says that on our side, the war should be defensive. He decides that fighting the British straight up is a losing proposition, unless the Americans had some kind of advantage. And so he's already thinking, I think, in a different way, and a little more cleverly than just fighting a traditional European war. Although it must be said that was always his goal. He always wanted to have a proper European army, and the American army would get better and better over time. But Washington was an opportunist. He did want to take the fight to the British, and we see that in his surprise attack on the British, and actually the German Hessian mercenaries that fought on the British side at Trenton. Washington leaves on Christmas night, 1776, and of course that's depicted in this very famous painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, which has all types of inaccuracies, to the point that I tell my students at GW, if they get stuck in an art class and are really struggling, just to get a black canvas and put some white dots on it and call it Washington Crossing the Delaware, and it'll be more accurate than this painting. The one thing that we usually think is wrong, Washington standing up, is probably one thing that's actually correct, but it would have been a different watercraft, a different vessel. It would have been more like a barge that you see in the background. But it did, this painting, I think, does capture Washington's leadership accomplishment. This was something that didn't happen in European war. Men didn't fight in winter usually. They certainly didn't fight in snowstorms or on holidays. So Washington wins this, and then he retreats back into Pennsylvania and does it again, essentially 2 weeks later in the Battle of Princeton. You see him here in the buff and blue uniform that he favored for American uh, military officers. So these are all important victories just for building the morale, for winning hearts and minds on the American side. It's also a fun story from the Battle of Princeton for any of you Hamilton fans. During that battle, some American artillery captain shot a cannonball into Nassau Hall, which is the center of Princeton University to this day. And at the time, the British were holding Princeton. And so one of the cannon shot actually beheaded this painting of George II. And of course, according to Princeton lore, it was none other than Alexander Hamilton who did that. We have no proof of this, but it's a good story. It didn't even make the musical, which I think is too bad. So after this point, these early victories, the Americans actually lose quite a bit, and it's often said that Washington lost more battles than he won. And if you're just, if you're keeping score, and I guess that's what we do as historians, we keep score. That's absolutely true. He did, but he helps to win the big battles and see the big picture. And like I said, this whole time he's keeping this army together and keeping this cause going. So America's next big victory after surrendering Philadelphia, which was the seat of government at the time, comes at Saratoga. And we got to be careful because this white-haired gentleman here is not George Washington. It's actually a British general named Horatio Gates, who was British born, but fought on the American side, and turns out to be one of the main rivals to Washington's leadership during the war. But Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, before he pulled a Benedict Arnold, while he's still fighting on the American side, are critical to the victory at Saratoga, which is in upstate New York, and succeeded in taking a British army of several thousand. And I'm guessing for your Texas standards, the one thing that you really want to know about Saratoga and why it's always so important is that it wins French hearts and minds. So it convinces the French to come in on the American side, which they do by February of 1778, with a lot of diplomacy from Benjamin Franklin. And so in many respects, this is kind of halftime of the Revolutionary War. The very first half is the traditional colonial conflict between the colonies and Great Britain. This next part that I'm going to talk about, 1778 to 1781, is a global war. And things really change after the French and later the Spanish come into the war. So on the French side, there's new personnel that arrive. The Marquis de Lafayette, the young dashing aristocrat who really romanticized the American cause, had already been in North America, but he goes back to France. He convinces the old guard, including General Rochambeau, the most experienced general on either side in the war dating back to the 7 Years' War, uh, convinces him to join. And so there's an infusion of military talent on the American side. But maybe the most important thing that the French provide is a distraction to the British. The British have to withdraw many of their forces from the Western Hemisphere in order to protect against an invasion of England. And so on a clear day, you can see the French coast from the English coast, from Dover to Calais. And so this was a real legitimate concern that the British had. Um, One thing that the French couldn't do is improve the horrible winter of 1777, 1778. So that's the famous Valley Forge winter in Pennsylvania, when Washington, again, keeps his army together. And it's significant that he stays with his army. Again, this was not a European practice. The European practice would be for officers to go home in winter, come back maybe later when it's getting closer to the time to fight. But Washington stayed with his army all 8 winters, and Martha Washington, his spouse, did as well. She was actually with George Washington more than half of the war. And so at Valley Forge, Washington also, uses this opportunity to train his army and to again use European talent to do that. And I guess the main European talent at this time was this handsome man, Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, better known as Baron von Steuben. And if anybody uses the old PBS Liberty Kids program in your classroom, this is Arnold Schwarzenegger in the role of a lifetime. You get to be Baron von Steuben. And there's a lot of fun things about von Steuben, but I think the most significant one is that he was a Prussian or German officer, but of middle rank. But in talking to Benjamin Franklin in Europe, he basically created this backstory for himself, that he was an aristocrat, that he was a baron, that he was one of Frederick the Great's most important officers. None of this was true, but it's a great American self-invention story. And never underestimate the power of a good letter of recommendation, which Benjamin Franklin provides for von Steuben. He brings it to America. We think that Washington was onto him because von Steuben asked for a salary. He asked for money for his services, which, if you're a true aristocrat, you never do that. Just remember that, if you need to file that one away sometime. So von Steuben helps with the drilling of the American soldiers to the point that the U.S. Army, to this day, has some remnants of his drill and ceremony. And the new American Army really emerges and fights, I think, the most estimated and most important battle that's maybe the least known. That's the Battle of Monmouth, Battle of New Jersey. And the basic logic of this battle is that after having taken Philadelphia, the British decide that it's not really worth much, and so they're going to evacuate and consolidate their forces at New York. And so the Americans try to intercept them, and they fight to a standstill. And at this point, for the Americans, just having a tie is like a victory, and it helps to show that the American army is getting better and better. So all of this, in some ways affects this European influence. And I want to just take a second to talk about the Spanish and what they do. In many respects, they provide the same service as the French, and that is just forcing the British to fight on, other fronts in other places. It's important to specify that Spain never officially joins the American side. They join the French in declaring war on Britain, but it has more or less the same effect. And so Bernardo Galvez, the colonial governor of Louisiana, becomes a real military hero during this period, and benefits from Texas, from Spanish Texas, which provided a lot of supplies to the Americans in general and to Galvez's army in particular. So a little dip into Texas history here. Um, on the History Happy Hour, you don't just get the traditional Six Flags, you get seven, these flags of Texas. And as you can see in this period, this is the classic Spanish colonial period from 1690 to 1820. That's where we are in Spanish history. And here's a map of all this. And so Galvez learns that the British are planning to attack at New Orleans, which is always a really strategic point because whoever controls New Orleans generally controls the Mississippi River and the interior of North America. He learns about this in 1779 and prevents the attack. Basically intercepts the British and goes on the attack himself and wins in these different places on this map at Fort Butte, at Baton Rouge, and Natchez, which all protect, all end up protecting New Orleans. In 1780, he wins at Mobile, and in 1781, a really big victory at Pensacola, which was the seat of government for West Florida. At this time, the British had Florida, and it was divided into two different colonies, West Florida and East Florida. And so the British had no more bases, really no more operations in the Gulf of Mexico after this point. And so this will lead eventually to Florida being turned over to the Spanish in the Treaty of Paris. And it would stay that way until 1819 when it became part of the United States. And I don't need to tell all of you that Galvez is celebrated to this day in different parts of the Gulf Coast and in Texas, probably most famously because of Galveston, Texas, where we had one of the greatest humanities Texas programs of all time many years ago. So I'm going to turn back to the British, but keeping in mind that all these other things are going on in different places that are sapping British energy, British forces. So the British in the second half of the war, because they have to fight the French and then the Spanish, and then are also entangled with the Dutch to a certain extent, they decide to focus on the southern states, the former southern colonies in North America, where they have more loyalist support, and they decide that their prospects would be better there. And the person who heads up this operation is Lord Charles Cornwallis, this general right here. And I'm going to show a very old school map, which I like just for simplicity. The jagged line here is the British Army, and they had early victories. They won at Charleston, they won at Camden, but then they started to have trouble, and the British ran into a couple of really irascible foes. One was Mel Gibson. You've seen the Patriot, a Mel Gibson-like figure, like Francis Marion, who's partly patterned after in that film, and the American militia turned out to be really difficult, enemies for the British. This is really like a civil war in the South. I don't want to endorse the Patriot in any way because it's a lot of history malpractice in that film. The historian David Hackett Fisher had a great line about the Patriot. He said, "The Patriot is to history as Godzilla is to biology." And that might not be fair to Godzilla, but it got one thing right, and that was this real difficult fighting in the South, the Civil War-like atmosphere. The other foe that the British face is the mosquito. Mosquitoes that spread malaria, which really decimated the British Army. Americans also suffered from malaria, but they had become more seasoned over time. But Cornwallis's army really gets worn down. So if you look at this jagged line, part of the logic of his movements is he's trying to get north into a less hot and humid climate where there are fewer mosquitoes and where his army, might escape the Francis Marion types, Nathaniel Greene, who's the main Continental Army general in the South, and get some relief from this disease. And so where he ends up going is Yorktown. I think I can use my cursor here, which right here, which is a peninsula. And one thing you might ask your students, why in the world would Cornwallis put his army out on a peninsula where he could be easily trapped? And the answer is that he expected relief from the British Navy, which generally controlled the seas in 18th century warfare. It was a pretty safe bet. But this one time, the French Navy defeated the British. Rochambeau knew that the French Navy had this opportunity and convinced Washington to march southward. And you can see the blue line of Rochambeau and Washington moving southward to Yorktown in order to trap Cornwallis. This is another example of Washington being willing to change his mind. Because he had lost New York at the beginning of the war, um, he really is always preparing for the climactic battle there. He thought that New York would really decide the war. And it takes some convincing, but he does go south. And this is the first time he visits home during the entire war. So he's with his army for more than 8 years, more than 3,000 days. And if you learn just a little bit about George Washington and his home in Mount Vernon, you know that he's a homebody. He loves his home, but he's like the homebody that can't be home. And he stops on the way for 3 days because it would have been kind of rude. The road went right by Mount Vernon, but that's the only time in the entire war that he went home. So at Yorktown, the Americans and the French fight a real traditional siege battle, kind of like a smaller version of what took place in World War One. In this image, the British are in the background, close to the York River and the Chesapeake Bay, again, where Cornwallis is basically trapped. So the logic is just to move closer and closer until they could overtake Cornwallis's army. And they eventually do that in October, mid-October of 1781. So we're coming upon that anniversary. One of my dear sisters' birthday is October 19th, which is the day of the surrender of Cornwallis. So it's always good for me to do this lecture in the fall because I'll remember now. I can send my sister a birthday card. And in this painting by John Trumbull, one of the famous paintings in the Capitol Rotunda, George Washington is back and to the right. Cornwallis decided not to show up. And for the longest time, historians had interpreted that as basically that he was embarrassed, that he had hard feelings, that he basically was ashamed. But we now think that he actually was sick. He almost certainly had malaria. So he sent his second in command to offer the sword of surrender. And so Washington presented his second in command, a man named Benjamin Lincoln, who's on the white horse in the foreground. You Hamilton fans, I'm going to use my cursor again here. Alexander Hamilton is right here next to the horse. And next to Alexander Hamilton is John Lawrence, who also can sing pretty well based on the musical. So this is a really interesting primary source. I want you to look at it closely. This is kind of the American version of events. This is the French version of Yorktown. And I think this is a great teaching tool with students because you can show them these two different perspectives and say, what's emphasized, what's not emphasized as much in these two accounts. And obviously in this French version, the Navy is the big deal, right? You see all the naval ships. And in fact, there were more French service members at the Battle of Yorktown than Americans. So we could very much think of it as a French victory. The other kind of fun thing about this is that it gets that point right, but it gets all the details wrong. If you've been to Yorktown, you know it's not like Disneyland. It doesn't have castles and all these amazing Game of Thrones kind of like things. There's no mountains at Yorktown, but it kind of gets this larger truth correct. So you can almost put these images side by side. The French one is done in a more contemporary time. It's in 1781, so it's closer to events, but it's done from Paris, and it's based on secondhand reports. John Trumbull wasn't at Yorktown, but he talked to people who were. So even though his painting is from the 1820s, in some ways it's more immediate. But again, I think a useful kind of exercise to show students that the primary sources are flawed in different ways, and although they have a lot of value, we still have to read them critically. All right, so one thing the Battle of Yorktown did was invent font. If you ever read an early American newspaper, you know that basically inhuman fonts. They're so small because they had to cram as many words on a page as they could to save money. But here we get font size of different sorts and Laus Deo, thanks be to God. There was a sense that the Americans had done something really momentous in this victory. The British thought so as well. The British Prime Minister at the time, Lord North, who always looks kind of worried, upon hearing about this battle, he said, "Oh God, it is all over." And in fact, it was. The British Parliament voted to stop fighting the Americans at this point, but they love fighting the French. And so they keep fighting the French and Spanish for a couple more years. So that's why you get an end date of the war in 1783. The one person who wasn't on board with stopping the fighting of the Americans was George III. George was a hardliner throughout this entire process. So in that sense, the musical Hamilton is correct that he really did want to keep all his lovely American subjects as long as he could, and was so devastated by this defeat that he actually wrote a message abdicating the throne, that he was going to step down as king. But this is a good lesson for our students. He kept it in his draft box. He didn't hit send and slept on it and decided to stay on as king and would become the longest serving monarch in British history, later surpassed by Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II. There's another film on the American Revolution that's a little bit older and a little bit drier, but it's called The Madness of King George. In Britain, that film was called The Madness of King George III, but they tested it with American audiences and focus groups, and they realized that they couldn't call it The Madness of King George III in America because Americans thought it was a sequel, and they had missed the first two. So this is why we need you educators, and we need humanities texts because we have to raise the overall education level of the American public. All right, so I'm going to close here just talking briefly about the piece in the very end, and we have a primary source to get into this in a little more detail. But basically, Washington was camped out for the last nearly 2 years of the war here in Newburgh, New York. And his leadership challenge at this point was basically how to keep an army happy that didn't really have anybody to fight and wasn't being paid and was worried about the future. And he had to put down different, near mutinies. The most famous of which is called the Newburgh Crisis and the Newburgh Mutiny. And again, we'll look at this a little bit more closely in the primary source part of the program. While this is happening in Newburgh and while Washington's keeping his army there, there's peace negotiations in Europe. And this is the most famous painting of that process in Paris. And you can see Benjamin Franklin in the center, one of the American negotiators. And I love this, and it kind of says a lot about this piece, that the British negotiators refuse to pose for the painting. So they never get painted. It's just the Americans here. And there is a real sense by historians that the Americans do very well in the negotiations with the British. The British do pretty well with the French, and the Spanish do pretty well too. But I think the Americans and the Spanish are the big victors. So here's some of the provisions of the overall Peace of Paris. The U.S. gains all the land east of the Mississippi River, except Florida, which goes to the Spanish. And this was significant. This was a huge part of the continent and much more than the Americans had settled up to this point. So that's part of the triumph of this negotiation. France gets some islands, recovers some islands in the Caribbean. I mentioned the Spanish getting Florida and Minorca. And what Britain basically salvages is the rest of their empire. They keep their empire in India and also in the West Indies or the Caribbean. One thing that we'll talk about leading into our next program for next week is that the U.S. Pledged to basically honor its debts and to compensate loyalists. And the British never feel like they actually do that. So that's going to set up some later foreign policy conflicts with the British. So that's the cliffhanger for next week. So the most significant thing that Washington does, maybe in the entire war, is resign his commission. And so he did this on December 23rd, 1783. The American seat of government moved around. If you drive along the East Coast, you'll see that different places claim to be the American capital. Princeton claimed to one time be the American capital, Trenton, and this event depicted here took place in Annapolis, Maryland. And that's because the Congress was on the run during the war. The first half of the war, they're on the run from the British, and in the second half, they're on the run from the unpaid American army that they're afraid is going to rise up. And what was so significant about this is that it really reversed the script of world history. That up to this point in major wars, successful military leaders had basically held on to power. Whether it was Caesar in ancient times or an Oliver Cromwell in the more recent, English history. And Washington followed through on what he had promised to do at the beginning of the war, and that was to give up power. And this was the classic small R Republican move. And it was such a kind of an epic event that even King George III said that if this was true, if Washington had given up power, he will be the greatest man in the world. And so even King George had a sense that this was something very special, and it raises a big question for us historians, and that is, what if America didn't have a George Washington, someone that showed such restraint and had these small R Republican values? Well, fortunately, we have a video game to provide the answer. Just like there's an app for everything, we have a video game for everything. And that video game is Assassin's Creed 3, The Tyranny of King Washington. And it works so well as sort of this dystopian fantasy because it was so far from what might have actually happened. Washington never comes close to not giving up power and resists any suggestion that he should do otherwise. And so I was asked recently by an audience if I've actually played this game before. And all I could really claim, truthfully, is I own it. But there's too many buttons on the control. That's changed a lot since I was young. So I'm going to stop here. We can do some Q&A, and then we'll get into some of our documents. All right, Liz, what do we got?
Nothing yet, but I sent a reminder. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand and unmute yourself, that would be fine too.
Yes, please. That would
So
be
we'll give
great.
them a few minutes to come up with some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So that Assassin's Creed 3 thing, I did an interview with a online gaming magazine about that. And I think it's the high point of my career. I've never been able to do anything to so impress my own kids and my students. But someday, maybe this is it. Maybe the History Happy Hour, the return of the History Happy Hour.
Did you get an invitation from them for that? Like, did they reach out to you?
They did. They reached out to me.
Fascinating.
It lives somewhere online to the point that my students now think I was an advisor to the game, which it's not true. It's not very Washingtonian of me, but I've kind of just gone with it. I'm like, yeah.
Well, we'll find it, I'm sure. But we do have a question, a couple
Okay.
questions coming through. We have one from Frank. He said, how did Washington experience Morristown? Was it really worse than Valley Forge?
Yeah, great question, and very well informed, because Washington actually had worse winters, and the winters in Morristown, especially 1780, 81, just in terms of the conditions, were worse. I think that one reason we remember Valley Forge, and this is a good historical question. I mean, why, if this is true, why do we put so much stock into Valley Forge? And I think it's that point of the war that Washington is really, really trying to get support from Congress. And so I think he successfully politicizes Valley Forge more than he needed to do with Morristown, although he still is writing lots and lots of letters then trying to get support from Congress. So that's a great question, and definitely in New Jersey they teach about Morristown. New Jersey humanities. That's where we go next.
We have a couple more questions that have come through. Cullen asks, how close did Washington come to being replaced during the war?
Oh my gosh, another winning question. So not super close, but it's really important to emphasize that his leadership is challenged at various points, and so he's not able to win in a really traditional way, like I talked about, fighting the British army to army, at least at the beginning. And so he becomes known as a Fabian general, and this is named after an ancient Roman general, Fabius Maximus. It's like three other names, who won wars and battles by wearing down his opponent and not necessarily fighting. And so Washington, I don't think he's fully a Fabian general because as we talked about, he always does want to take the battle to the British, but he's characterized as that. And the two people that give him the strongest leadership challenge were both British-born generals. So one is Horatio Gates, who I mentioned, and the other is Charles Lee, who, if you know your Hamilton, uh, he's the general that was at the Battle of Monmouth that began to retreat. And in the middle of the battle, and this was depicted in the painting I had in the slides, Washington pushes the line back forward and basically won't let his men retreat. So every time that I think Washington's close to maybe being replaced, or people thinking about that, he manages to come up with a victory of some sort.
All right, we have a couple more. Isaiah asked, what is the reason Washington never had his own blood children?
Yeah, good question. That's getting into Washington's private life there. So we don't entirely know the answer to that, but the theory among historians is that as a young man, as a young adult, Washington travels to Barbados with his older half brother Lawrence Washington. This is the farthest he actually traveled from North America. He never goes to Europe, and he got smallpox in Barbados. This turns out to be a superpower during the Revolutionary War because he can't get smallpox again. And he argues for inoculating his men, which was controversial at the time because it wasn't a vaccine where you give like a strain of sort of a different disease or an alternative, strain. You actually give a mild form of the actual disease, smallpox, which is a great depiction in the miniseries John Adams that you can gross out your students with. But because of this, it's possible that Washington was sterile. This is one of the side effects, can be one of the side effects of smallpox, and so that's our best theory on that. Just one last thought about that. It turned out to be fortuitous for the American Republic. Four out of the first five presidents didn't have sons. So think about the one that did, was John Adams, and his son John Quincy Adams became president. Not right away. There's a decent gap between them, but I think it helped not having a immediate heir. And Washington even says this in speeches. He's kind of defensive about all the power he gets in this new republic, and basically says, "Don't worry, I'm not trying to, take over with some kind of dynasty because I don't have any. I don't have any kids."
We got a question from Maria. She said her students always ask, who was running Mount Vernon during the revolution?
Wow, you have smart students to think about that. So uh, there's a fun book about this, fun in kind of an academic sense, but a book by a historian named Bruce Ragsdale. It's called Washington at the Plow, and we could probably get that into your materials around the chat, which will tell you more than you ever wanted to know. But Washington is constantly writing letters back to Mount Vernon during the war. I mean, that's really where a big part of his mind and definitely his heart was. Even during that New York campaign, maybe that's why he lost to the British. He's writing too many letters to Mount Vernon. But the person who manages Mount Vernon during most of that period is Lund Washington, who was a cousin. And Washington has different farm managers. Martha Washington, of course, was important when she wasn't actually with George. But Lund Washington's biggest mistake in the eyes of George Washington during the war happened in 1781, prior to the Battle of Yorktown. Benedict Arnold, by this point, is on the British side. He was leading raids along with other British officers of Virginia plantations. And Washington warned, no matter what, don't give in to the British. Don't, give support to the enemy. Don't give them comfort. Don't give them supplies. And so Lund Washington, imagine the position he was in when a British warship sailed along the Potomac River and trained its guns on Mount Vernon, on the house. It could blow it away. And he basically faced a choice, provide the British some supplies, negotiate, or they were going to fire on Mount Vernon. And Lund Washington ends up giving the British some supplies. Because, and I have a lot of time, I'll talk more about this next week, the issue of slavery. The British provide freedom to enslaved African Americans who run to their side during the war. And in this episode, 17 of George Washington's enslaved workers run to the British side. And Washington is furious at Lund Washington. George Washington's furious at Lund Washington. And not necessarily because he lost these enslaved workers, but because Lund had given comfort to the British. And Washington constantly worries about his reputation, and he had asked everyone not to support the British. And so it looks like, he's an exception, or he's worried about that. So that's it's a long answer to a good question.
We have one more question in the chat before we move on to our next part of the webinar. And it might be more of a question for next week, but I'll go ahead and throw it out there. But Frank asked, can you talk about the history and importance of teaching the farewell address in school?
Oh yeah, that is so great. So we're gonna do that next week. We're gonna do the farewell address. So I hope you can be here live, but if not, get the recording. And I'll just say one fun thing related to this week's topic. Washington has 3 addresses he writes that are identified as the farewell address. And his first one comes at the end of the Revolutionary War. He writes something called the Circular Letter to the States in June of 1783. And you can find this online, and we can get you the link for it. But it's really an amazing document where he's urging a stronger national government already in 1783. He's already kind of anticipating the Constitution at this point. And this was called Washington's farewell address. Then after his first term as president, he wrote a farewell address of James Madison. So that's the second one. Of course, he doesn't deliver that. And then the third one that he writes with Alexander Hamilton is the one that we actually call the farewell address. And stay tuned. I'll try to have some clever thoughts. If I start working now, Liz, by next week, I'll have something on the farewell address.
We'll save that question. We'll ask it again next week, Frank.
All right. Yeah, we will. Yeah. Great. So
that's all we have for now. So let's move along to the next session.
Keep on moving. Yeah, this is the great thing about the history happy hour. We keep on rolling. All right. So let me pull up another slideshow here. And even though I'm doing this, I want everyone to still be active, ask questions. Liz will help tell me if there's a question. And this is kind of an easier way to share some of the sources for tonight. So the first group start with Washington getting command of the American army. And so I kind of have a group of sources, from the beginning of the war and the end of the war. And so we talked about how this happened in the Second Continental Congress, how he wore his uniform, except it didn't look like this. It looked like this. He says, "Who, me? You want me to be the general?" And then he accepts. And this is the first written document. And this is my Professor Joe Kabilka joke, my PowerPoint school. I didn't graduate from PowerPoint school. You can tell because I have so much text on this slide. I've almost got thrown in PowerPoint jail, but I escaped. So we're not going to read all of this, but just take a look at some of these words. And if you read it before the session, you're familiar with this. He's expressing great modesty. And what I want you to think about when we're looking at this and the next document, the letter that he writes to Martha Washington soon after this, is, how are they similar or different? And what do they tell us about the American Republic at this stage. And I'll just say, at the beginning he says, this is an incredible honor. I appreciate this, but he says, I feel great distress. And he goes on, he says that I might not be up to the task. And then he even like qualifies it in the second paragraph here, where he says that, if something horrible should happen, let it be remembered that I told you that I wasn't up to the task. I told you guys this. So he's already kind of doing the preemptive, excuse if something goes wrong. And then at the end he says, you can't pay me for this. I'm not gonna, I'll keep my receipts. And believe me, he did. He got reimbursed for every espresso, but he doesn't want to be paid. Okay, so that's his letter to Congress. He then writes to Martha Washington, which is an even longer letter. We're not going to go into all of it, but just at the very beginning, he says, I'm going to write to you on a subject that fills me with inexpressible concern. Consider that he just got the job of a lifetime, right? But it sounds like somebody's died. He says, it's been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care. And he says, you can believe me that I assure you in the most solemn manner that I didn't seek this appointment. In fact, I tried to avoid it, but I had to say yes. I had no other option. Incidentally, we only have 3 surviving letters from George and Martha Washington. This is one of them. She burned all of the letters between her and George after George Washington died, which was probably in keeping with his wishes. That's what we think. And so he goes on to say, to continue talking about how he doesn't feel up to the task. And in the end of the letter, he talks about how, for her safety, that she should really go to Alexandria. So I'm gonna stop here for a second, and I just want to hear from anybody, any folks, any kind of ideas about if anybody noticed any differences in these 2 letters, or just more generally, what do they tell us about this new country? What can we learn about the new United States from George Washington's letters? And don't be bashful. Any answer is helpful. Try to help getting us going. So yeah, feel free to write in the chat, or you can raise your cartoon hand, raise it high and proud. Any thoughts about, all this modesty of George Washington? What could it possibly mean? Liz, I don't know about you, but if I get a promotion, I'm going to be a little happier than mopey George here, sad George.
We got
um,
some things coming through. Lindsay says, I think Washington's modesty would be an interesting touch point for students. We could compare him to modern politicians, athletes, etc. Tyler comments, high expectations, low pay, low support, long hours. Sounds like teaching. Kathleen says, what he was nervous about the odds, question mark.
I love that. Washington is the teacher. He was kind of like a teacher. He's always assigning reading to his officers. He's like the teacher that had very high expectations, trying to bring his people up to task. Yeah, so these are
Tyler
all
also says that Washington's humility wins his critics over.
okay, great. So these are all such good and important thoughts. And I see that Melissa chimed in too, that it's similar about, to the farewell address and how it'll be remembered. And this is all part of this culture at the time of republicanism, that no one person is really thought to be bigger than the cause and the full republic. And the Latin root of republican is res publica, which translates to the common thing. So you might have heard about the Commonwealth of Virginia, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or something like that. It's kind of the commonweal, and the idea is social equality among, this time, white men, women, people of color were excluded, of course, from that at this time. But this was a big change from the aristocracy and the hierarchy of the British Empire. And so, the word of the day There's a great word we're going to learn here. So good. Let's see if I can type it. Let's see if I can spell disinterest. Oh, see, this is almost as bad as writing on the board, but you guys can't even see what I'm doing right now. Okay. Disinterested. I think I did spell it right. Disinterested. So we hear this word today and we think that it means, somebody's uninterested. But in the 18th century, disinterestedness was the opposite of self-interest. That you couldn't show self-interest because that was not part of the Republican common good. You had to be disinterested. You had to be above self-interest. Again, I keep referring to Hamilton, but the depiction of Aaron Burr in Hamilton is absolutely correct. Everyone hated Aaron Burr because they thought he was self-interested. In the farewell address, what's the problem with political parties? They were self-interested. They weren't disinterested. So it looks like we have one more comment, Liz.
Yeah, Tyler says landowning class deference system still was a major factor in Washington's ascent. Most of the early presidents were Virginian planter class.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this deferential culture is going to continue, really, until the Jacksonian era or so. So let's turn to the next set of sources, and these are just kind of a snapshot of Washington's leadership. And I picked an episode, just a random episode from the Revolutionary War that took place in that period at Newburgh, where the American army has no one to fight. And I think it helps to show some things about Washington. So we're gonna look at two letters that Washington writes to this poor guy, Thomas Lansdale, who's the officers in charge of a Maryland unit in the Continental Army. It is relatively new at the end of the war, and comes into Newburgh. We're going to read this first letter, and this is just the first part of it. But Washington writes to Thomas Lansdale, um, and they kind of had an inspection, like a muster. He says, "I was hurt yesterday at the appearance of the detachment under your command, as I conceive you must have been if you viewed and drew a comparison between it and the regiment on your left. The clothes of the latter have been upon the soldiers' backs almost, if not quite, 12 months. Well, it's only been 6 months since you've been here. Dirt and trash, liberally strewn. There was even dirt and trash immediately before the doors of your huts. It was difficult to avoid the filth. The true distinction, sir, between what is called a fine regiment and an indifferent one will ever, upon investigation, be found to originate in and depend upon the care or the inattention of the officers belonging to them." So basically, shame on you, Thomas Lansdale. So I want to stop now, and here's the race to the chat. This is what I want you guys to write. What does this tell us about Washington as a leader? And what could he do to Thomas Lansdale at this point? I mean, how could he actually correct this filth and this embarrassing spectacle of his line unit? So what are some things that you notice in Washington in that letter that we just looked at real quick? So a few thoughts. I love that. Jason says he was politely telling Lansdale his unit is a bunch of slobs. I think he nailed it. Maybe not even so politely. All right. Great leaders praise publicly and they rebuke privately. Right. I love this. So, Washington's calling him out as a slacker. 18th century football coach. Good. Was this post von Steuben? Good. Yeah. So this is post von Steuben, and this is probably something, Washington first learned from the British Army, but he would have picked this up from von Steuben too. And that is that you have to keep a clean army. You have to pay attention to detail. In the army to this day, the reason why they're so picky about everything is because if you can't get the small things right, if you can't march right, if you can't act in unison, how are you going to act, in battle and when you're under fire? And so, that's one thing that's certainly true from the 18th century. All right, so we have discipline. He cares about his men. The officers need to do this. I love this. Okay, so I'm gonna jump back up, and we're gonna see the exciting conclusion of this. So Washington ends his first letter to Lansdale saying, "I'm gonna give you a couple weeks to do better," and so he's going to inspect him again in a couple weeks. And this is letter number 2, and you guys have access to this. And he says, "It gave me very sensible pleasure to observe at the review yesterday the very great alteration for the better in the appearance of the men of the Maryland detachment." He says, "Be pleased to make known to the officers and men the satisfaction I experienced on this occasion, and at the same time to acquaint them that I anticipate the day when this detachment will rival, if not surpass in excellence, the oldest and best troops in the American service." And he ends it by saying, I enjoyed this as much as it had pained me before with how bad you were the last time that I saw you." So all the things you wrote were right on. I mean, really brilliant. That you nailed it. That Washington is kind of like the 18th century teacher or coach, and sets very high expectations, but then makes it possible to meet them. Right? He creates a standard that can be met, and he could have done all kinds of things with Lansdale. I mean, he could have, if you want to be a really hardliner, he could have had him arrested. He could have had him, he could have dismissed him. He could have, got him out of the army. But you can see that he worked with them. And then so fast forward a couple of months later, this is when the Newburgh conspiracy took place, where it turned out that a number of Washington's officers, including Horatio Gates, seemed to be plotting to possibly pressure Congress in some way to make sure they got their pensions and other pay. And this would have violated the division between civil and military power in the United States, where civil power, you know, um, is held over military power. And so Washington was furious, and he addressed his men. And as a part of his speech, he pulled out a letter from a member of Congress. He had recently gotten a pair of glasses, and he kind of fumbles with the glasses, and he says, "I have not only grown gray in the service of my nation, but I've also grown blind." And all his men start crying. He had shown that vulnerability as a leader, and you can see why it resonated, because he had worked so well with his men up to that point. And we see that in this sort of just random moment with um with Thomas Lansdale. So I want to go again to this your last source to that I've shared with you. It's a really short letter, a really important letter, I think, for just the history of America's Republican experiment. And it's this same scene where Washington resigns his commission at Annapolis, Maryland on December 23rd, 1783. There's a lot of inaccuracies in this painting. Maybe the biggest one is that Martha Washington was not in the balcony. I don't think there even was a balcony, but if there was, Martha Washington wasn't there because she was at Mount Vernon waiting for George, where he would come home next day in time for Christmas. But this is what he wrote, and so this is what what I want you to think about is what his words tell us again about this early American Republic, what they tell us about him. And so, he says that the great events on which my resignation depended, having at length taken. I'm going to find my copy of this letter. I have now the honor of offering my sincere congratulations to Congress and of presenting myself before them to surrender into their hands the trust committed to me and to claim the indulgence of retiring from the service of my country. Happy in the confirmation of our independence and sovereignty, and pleased with the opportunity afforded the United States of becoming a respectable nation. I resign with satisfaction the appointment I accepted with diffidence. A diffidence, and that kind of means a humility, kind of like you guys talked about, in my abilities to accomplish so arduous um, a task. Sorry, I skipped to page 2 in all my excitement. So he basically says, we won the war. It turned out even better than I thought. And so he comes now and he says, it would be an injustice if I didn't acknowledge all the men that served under me. And he particularly cites these officers that he knew as his family, and he actually called them his family. And so he invokes God here at the end. And at the very last lines, he says, having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life. So maybe some closing thoughts. Is this the same Washington that we met in 1775? Do you see a consistency? Is there anything different, or does he kind of seem like the same person? And what are some of the things that we can learn about this new country that's being created in this event, this resignation? Liz, what do we got? What do you think?
We got a couple coming through. Lindsay says, still humble, but less nervous or fearful. Anthony said he stayed humble and true to his character throughout the war. Cullen comments, reflective and humble.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. And it's true, right? That it's not like he's not spiking the football. We'll stay with the football metaphor. I know my audience. He's handing the football to the ref after he scores, right? He's not no touchdown dance, nothing fancy like that.
Jason comments, he seems to be the type of military commander most military members only dream of.
It sounds like you might have been in the
Humble,
service.
humble
Yeah.
and trusting God to guide the country.
Yeah, yeah. No, these are all great thoughts. And it's easy to kind of say a phrase like someone puts that someone knows that a cause is larger than just themselves, or any one person. But that was really the way that Washington treated this. Even though scholars have called him the indispensable founder, that without him, it's kind of hard to imagine the whole cause staying together. It's not that it wouldn't have happened, but we're hard pressed, and this goes back to the question about whether there was someone else who might have taken charge. It's not really evident who that would have been. George Washington said during the war that his most trusted officer was Nathaniel Greene, who was the main officer that was fighting Cornwallis in the southern states. But Greene certainly didn't have the same connection with men, or the same fame by this point that Washington had. Um, so I think the Teeks get it right that Washington shows up so many times in different contexts. That's why we need a 2-day seminar, right, Liz? Not just one. And I love that what Becky wrote, that he trusts the men taking up the mantle to guide the country. Exactly. And I think this is the whole point, that Republican government is representative government, and it can't work if it just depends on one person. And so I think he creates the space for Republican government to flourish, to happen. Now, this is what we're going to think about during the week before we do our next session. He very much retires at, those words, we just read them, that, he's leaving public life. He says that. He modeled his actions in part and was considered by many to be the American Cincinnatus, another Roman figure. Cincinnatus was a farmer. He left to defend the Republic, went back to the plow, went back to his home afterwards. Well, Cincinnatus never had a second act. That's why he was Cincinnatus. Washington is going to be asked to come back into service again, and he's going to hesitate because he promised the American people he was done. And so this is one of the things that we will look at next week on the Huzzah Hour, on the History Happy Hour.